He gave up the interview that could change his life, just to help an old man in the rain. 3 days later, a stranger called him into the 85th floor. He thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. Rain hammered the sidewalk like it had something to prove. It soaked the backs of jackets, pelted passing cars, and clung to the glass towers that lined the avenue like judgment. Daniel stood still at the edge of the crosswalk, shoulders tense, head slightly bowed as water dripped from his hair onto the lapels of his only suit. The fabric, once crisp and pressed with quiet hope, now clung to his frame like defeat. Somewhere behind him, a horn blared. Ahead, Henderson and Company loomed in the mist, its logo almost glowing against a silver skyline. He hadn't planned for this, not the storm, not the cold, and definitely not the feeling in his chest right now. Drenched, 5 minutes late and holding a leather portfolio that now sagged from water damage, Daniel closed his eyes briefly, maybe just for a few seconds, maybe to steady his breath, maybe to rewind. 3 hours earlier, he'd been in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 7th time. The suit felt tight in the shoulders, not because it didn't fit, but because it meant too much. He had saved for months, every tip from the Ghee coffee shop, every shift he took for someone else, every dinner he skipped just to put a little more aside. That navy blue suit was more than clothing. It was armor, proof that he belonged in that room today. He had placed his father's old watch on his wrist, almost out of habit. The silver casing still carried tiny scratches from years ago, back when his father would tap it impatiently while waiting for him to finish homework. The kind of watch that never looked expensive but always looked right. It had stopped ticking after his father passed, but Daniel wore it anyway. Somehow, it made things feel less scattered. He remembered checking forecasts. Cloudy, light showers, nothing serious. So he left early, just like he planned. 8:45 arrival for a 9:30 interview. Time to breathe, time to reset his nerves. That was the idea, at least. But as soon as he stepped out of the subway, the sky cracked open like someone had torn a seam. Not gentle drops, but walls of water, wind that turned umbrellas inside out. Street drains gave up trying to cope. He ducked into a coffee shop for cover, joining a dozen others who stood shoulder to shoulder, watching nature lash the city like a punishment. He checked his phone. No cars available. The taxi apps froze or spun endlessly. 8:20, then 8:30. Still nothing. By 8:45, panic had started to bubble beneath his calm. He bolted from the cafe and started walking, running really, through streets that looked more like rivers. Each step splashed filth onto his shoes, the ones he polished the night before like they were part of the interview themselves. His socks were soaked before he reached the second block. His shoulder bag was sliding, and the portfolio, God, he kept switching it from one arm to another, trying to keep it dry, failing with every step. He saw Henderson Tower from a distance, 7 blocks maybe. That was when the cab appeared, parked, at the curb, hazard lights blinking, someone just getting out. Daniel sprinted, dodging puddles and pedestrians, waving his arm. But a woman slipped into the back seat just as he reached the handle. The door shut. The cab rolled away. He stood there, blinking against the rain, and that's when he heard the voice. Low, a little shaky, maybe a little angry. Just off the street, tucked behind a silver sedan with a flat tire, was an older man, in a soaked trench coat, fumbling with a car jack that kept slipping on the wet pavement. Daniel hesitated just for a moment. He looked at the Henderson building, closer now. Maybe 10 minutes away if he ran. But then he looked back. It's strange how fast a decision can happen. How you can think of your dad and what he might say if he were watching. How the words come, back even if you haven't heard them in years. Character is not built when everyone's watching, son. It's built when no one sees and you help anyway. Daniel stepped forward, didn't say much, just nodded, took off his jacket, and knelt on the pavement. The water soaked through the pants in seconds. He took the jack and reset it more carefully, this time. The man looked at him, surprised at first, then relieved. They didn't talk much. Maybe that was better. Daniel didn't want to explain what he was giving up, and the man just seemed tired. By the time the spare tire was on, Daniel was muddy, wet, and shaking from the cold. The man offered him a ride. He took it, even though he knew he was late. He just wanted to show up, even if he was already too late. Now, standing at the crosswalk, looking up at that tower, Daniel felt something crack in him. Not a breakdown, just a small, quiet breaking. Because no one would ever know what he chose today. No one would care, except maybe him. He took a step forward, shoes squelched, portfolio soggy, tie crooked, but his back was straight. Whatever happened next, at least he had that. The rain didn't let up. If anything, it came down harder, like it was trying to make the day even more difficult, like it had something personal against him. Daniel's legs were sore from the run, his breath uneven, and the cold had begun creeping past the soaked layers of his clothes. He was maybe 4 blocks away now. Henderson and Company's tower loomed just ahead, the upper floors barely visible through the downpour. His interview was still technically possible, just barely. If he kept going, if he pushed. Through the last stretch, maybe caught the elevator right away, he might still make it, 5 minutes late at most. Not ideal, but maybe not disqualifying. That's when he heard the voice again. It came from the right, near a quiet side street. Not a shout exactly, more like frustration pushed through gritted teeth. Daniel turned his head, water sliding into his eyes. At first, he saw only the outline of a car, a black sedan angled weirdly at the curb. One tire was visibly flat, the front passenger side sunken low, the rim nearly touching the pavement. Beside it stood an older man, bent over awkwardly, struggling with a car jack that clearly wasn't cooperating. Daniel's first instinct was to keep moving. He didn't stop, not immediately. He took 2 more steps toward his future, then another. But the sound of metal slipping, the man's strained sigh, the obvious helplessness of the scene. It caught in, a way that pulled harder than logic. His chest tightened, his feet slowed, then stopped. For a moment, he just stood there in the rain, watching. The man was clearly in his 70s, maybe older, white hair soaked flat against his scalp. His overcoat was darkened with water, sleeves heavy. The car jack slipped again, clattering against the wet pavement. The old man exhaled and leaned on the car for support. There was no one else nearby, no one coming to help. Daniel looked at his watch. 9:18, 12 minutes to his interview. He could make it, but only if he left right now, and even then he'd be cutting it too close. The streets were flooded, crosswalks clogged, and he'd still need to get through security. Every second counted. Everything he had worked for, every late night, every resume tweak, every practice session with mock questions and elevator pitches, all hinged on this interview. And this interview was slipping away, one raindrop at a time. He blinked, then blinked again. The old man tried repositioning the jack, hands trembling just slightly, and Daniel's body moved before his brain made a final decision. He didn't call out, didn't ask permission. He just turned and walked toward the car. "Sir," he said, raising, his voice slightly to be heard over the storm, "let me help." The old man looked up startled. For a second he seemed confused. Then something in his face softened. "Oh, thank heavens," he said, backing away from the wheel. "I thought I could manage on my own, but clearly I overestimated my coordination." Daniel gave a polite nod and quickly surveyed the situation. The jack had been placed incorrectly. No wonder it kept slipping. He opened the rear door, gently placed his portfolio on the back seat, then pulled off his suit jacket and laid it across the curb. It was already ruined, but it would keep his knees from scraping as he crouched beside the car. "You really don't have to," the man began, but Daniel was already setting the jack into place. "It's okay. I've done this before," he said, gripping the crank handle. "Used to help my uncle in his garage during summers." The man gave a soft chuckle. "A useful trade. Not many young people know how to change a tire these days." Daniel smiled faintly, but didn't answer. His fingers moved quickly, efficiently, despite the water streaming down his sleeves. The jack lifted the car inch by inch. His dress shirt was now translucent against his skin, his tie hung limp and stained. There was grease on his palm and dirt on his knee, and somewhere in the back of his mind, A voice kept whispering that time was running out. He checked his watch again, 9:24. He would miss it. The thought landed like a weight in his chest, but he didn't slow down. He removed the damaged tire, rolled it back to the trunk, and grabbed the spare. It was clean, unused, a small mercy. He mounted it, tightened each lug nut slowly and precisely, turning them in the star pattern his uncle had once drilled into his brain. Rain dripped from his eyelashes, his hair slicked to his forehead. The old man stood to the side now, watching, in silence. A few cars passed, sending ripples of water onto the sidewalk. The city kept moving around them. "You seem like you were on your way somewhere important," the man said, almost gently. Daniel didn't look up. "I was," he replied, tightening the last nut. "Job interview." There was a pause. "At Henderson." Daniel nodded. "Supposed to be there 10 minutes ago." The silence stretched for a few more seconds, long enough for Daniel to feel it settle. "I'm sorry," the man said. "If I had known." "It's fine," Daniel said quickly, standing up and brushing, his hands on his soaked pants. "You needed help. That's more important." He meant it, or he wanted to mean it, and maybe, deep down, he did. But it still hurt. As he lowered the jack and packed the tools into the trunk, he wondered if this one decision, this small, human decision, had cost him everything he'd worked toward. Then again, he couldn't imagine walking past. Not today, not in this weather, not with that voice from the past still echoing in his head, not with his father's watch on his wrist. Character isn't built when everyone's watching. It's built when you help anyway. The lobby was even grander than he remembered from the pictures. Marble floors, tall glass windows that stretched toward the ceiling in silence, polished, corporate silence. Every step Daniel took echoed. He left, a faint trail of muddy water behind him, his shoes squeaking against the floor with every step. A suited man glanced at him from behind a newspaper. Another woman walking by did a double take, then quickly looked away. Daniel's hands tightened around the soaked leather portfolio clutched to his chest. The receptionist didn't smile when he approached. She noticed him from across the desk, her eyes flicking down to his wet clothes before lifting back to meet. "Good morning," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I had an interview scheduled. Daniel Carter, 9:30. She tapped a few keys on her keyboard, her voice neutral, practiced. "Yes, Mr. Carter, you were on the list, but the appointment has already passed." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then hesitated. What was he supposed to say? That he stopped to help an old man change a tire in a storm? That he gave up the most important opportunity of his life because no one else would stop? That the suit he was wearing, now wrinkled and wet, had cost him nearly everything he had? "I understand," he said. Then, after a second, "But is there any way I could still speak to someone just for a moment? I came as fast as I could. I didn't expect the rain to be this bad." The receptionist looked at him more closely now. Her expression wasn't cruel, just firm, like someone who had seen too many people ask for exceptions. "Mr. Brennan has already moved on to the next candidate," she said, "and his schedule is full for the rest of the day." Daniel stood there motionless, water still dripping from his sleeves. He didn't know what he expected, but this quiet finality was hard to take. He reached into his bag and carefully pulled out another copy of his resume, one of the few papers that hadn't been ruined by the storm. It was damp at the edges, but still legible. "Could you at least give him this?" he asked. "And let him know I came." The woman accepted it, setting it aside with a polite nod. "Of course. I'll make sure he gets it." He gave her a small, tired smile. "Thank you." Then he turned around. Each step, away from the desk, felt heavier than the last. The lobby hadn't changed, but the feeling inside him had. When he walked in, he had still been holding on to something. Hope, maybe. Now, he just felt empty. Not angry, not embarrassed. Exactly, just finished. By the time he stepped back outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, almost as if the storm itself no longer cared. The sidewalk glistened, puddles reflecting traffic lights and gray skies. Daniel stood still for a few seconds, unsure where to go. He had no backup plan, no second interview lined up. This was the one. He started walking slowly without purpose. The cold wind found every gap in his shirt, curling around his spine and chest. He passed a coffee cart where a man was pouring something hot into a paper cup, steam rising in little curls. He didn't stop. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to explain. Part of him kept replaying the scene at the front desk, wondering if he should have pushed harder, maybe told her the whole story, maybe begged. But that wasn't him. And besides, would it have mattered? Still, beneath all the disappointment, there was something else. Quiet but there. A thread of certainty that didn't shout or shine. Just settled. He had done the right thing, even if it cost him everything. He crossed a wide street as the light blinked red. His shoes squelched with each step. The water in his socks had turned cold now, and every movement made it worse. But he kept walking. When he reached the subway entrance, he paused. The stairs led downward into shadow. A gust of wind tugged at his shirt. Behind him, the city moved. On. Cars honked, people rushed, phones rang. No one knew what he had just given up. No one had seen. Daniel exhaled slowly. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He just stood there, head tilted up toward the sky, which started to clear just a little. He wondered if his dad would have been proud. Probably not for missing the interview, but maybe for the other thing, for stopping, for helping, for not walking past. He let that thought sit with him for a moment. Then, quietly, he took the steps down into the station, the noise of the world above fading with each level. 3 days had passed, not long in the grand scheme of things, but to Daniel, it felt like a quiet eternity. The rainstorm was long gone, replaced by clear skies that felt somehow a little smug. His suit was back from the cleaners. It hung in his closet like a reminder, sharp creases, freshly pressed, untouched since that morning. He hadn't had the heart to put it on again. Not yet. He'd spent most of the last few days in his small apartment, hunched over his laptop, combing through job listings. Most of them didn't match his skill set, and the ones that did offered half the opportunity Henderson had. But he clicked through anyway, sending out resumes, tweaking cover letters. It felt like shouting into the void. His phone buzzed mid-morning. The screen lit up with an unknown number, local area code. For a second, he almost let it ring. Then something told him to answer. "Hello, Daniel Carter speaking." "Mr. Carter," a woman's voice said, polished and professional. "This is Sandra Mitchell. I'm the executive assistant to the CEO of Henderson and Company. I'm calling to invite you for a meeting this afternoon at 2 p.m. on the 85th floor. Would you be available?" Daniel blinked. He hadn't applied again. He hadn't even followed up. His first instinct was that it had to be a mistake. "I'm sorry," he said. "Did you say the 85th floor?" "Yes, sir. The executive offices." He stood up without meaning to, like his body needed help processing the words. "I'm available. May I ask what this is regarding? I missed my original interview earlier this week." There was a brief pause. Then Sandra said gently, "I'm afraid I wasn't given that information. I was simply asked to schedule the meeting." Daniel didn't know what to make of that. His first thought was that maybe it was some kind of polite dismissal, a way to reject him face to face, though that seemed unnecessary. Or maybe they were calling to offer him a lower level position, a courtesy role. That didn't make much sense either. Henderson and Company didn't waste executive time on people they didn't want. He checked the time, just after 11. That gave him 3 hours to get ready. He stared at the clean suit hanging in his closet, then opened the door slowly and took it down. He ran his hand along the fabric. It still held a faint scent of starch and rain, like the memory hadn't fully washed out. He dressed carefully like the first time, but with quieter movements. Less nervousness, more focus. He didn't expect anything, not really. He just didn't want to show up a second time looking like he didn't belong. By 1:15 he was in a taxi, sitting stiffly in the back seat as the city moved past the window. The traffic was light, the sky cloudless. It felt like a different world from the one he had trudged through in soaked shoes just days ago. At 1:45, Daniel stepped into the lobby of Henderson and Company for the second time. This time he was dry. This time he was early. And this time someone was waiting for him. The elevator ride was almost silent, just a soft mechanical hum and the faintest feeling of ascent in Daniel's chest. Floor numbers glowed one by one. He had never been this high up in any building before. The executive badge the receptionist had handed him earlier now sat clipped to his jacket pocket, and for some reason, it felt heavier than it should have, maybe just the weight of not knowing what was about to happen. When the doors slid open, onto the 85th floor, the atmosphere shifted. The lighting was softer, warmer. The carpet quieted his footsteps. Original art hung on the walls. Paintings, not prints. There was a stillness in the air that didn't feel empty, just intentional. Every detail seemed designed to remind you that this was where important decisions were made. A woman in a tailored suit stood near the reception desk, watching him with a calm, practiced smile. "Mr. Carter?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes. I'm Sandra Mitchell. We spoke on the phone. Thank you for coming on such short notice. The CEO is ready to see you now." Daniel's throat was dry, but he managed a polite smile. "Of course, thank you." She gestured for him to follow her down a quiet hallway, lined with framed photographs of the company's milestones. Early founding years, stock exchange ceremonies, charity partnerships. He didn't study them closely. His eyes were fixed on the end of the corridor, where a set of wide double doors waited slightly ajar. Sandra knocked once, then opened the right-hand door. "Mr. Carter is here, sir." A voice came from inside, deep, steady. "Send him in, Sandra." She gave Daniel a small nod and stepped aside. He walked forward, hands at his sides, unsure what expression to wear. The office beyond the doorway was larger than his apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city, the skyline sharp and golden in the afternoon light. A massive desk sat near the windows, organized but not sterile. Leather chairs, shelves lined with books, not awards. There was something surprisingly grounded about it all. The man behind the desk was turned away, standing at the window, his posture relaxed, one hand resting in his pocket. When he turned around, Daniel stopped breathing for a second. It was the man from the car, the one with the flat tire, the one he had helped in the rain. He stood there now, not soaked and fumbling but composed, clean suit, boots planted, expression calm but unmistakably familiar. "Hello again," the man said. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. The man stepped forward and offered his hand. "I believe we never got a proper introduction. I'm Chuck Norris." Daniel blinked. The name didn't register right away, not because he didn't recognize it, of course he did, but because his mind was still trying to line up the two images. Chuck Norris, the cultural icon, standing here as the CEO of Henderson and Company. Daniel shook his hand automatically. "I had no idea." "That's exactly why you're here," Chuck said, releasing the handshake with a faint smile. "You didn't know who I was, and you stopped anyway." Daniel sat when offered the seat across from the desk. His heart was still thudding, but he tried to keep his breathing even. "You helped me on a day when everything was stacked against you," Chuck continued. "You gave up something important, something you'd worked for. You never asked for anything, never even hesitated." "I did hesitate," Daniel said softly. "I almost walked past." Chuck nodded slowly. "But you didn't, and that's what matters." There was a pause, long enough for Daniel to absorb the moment. Chuck studied him, not as a celebrity, not as some unreachable figure, but with a kind of quiet observation that came from someone who had seen a lot and trusted actions more than words. "I came that day without my driver," Chuck said. "Wanted to be invisible for once. I like to see things as they are, to remind myself what it feels like to not be recognized. Life has a way of revealing people's character when no one's watching." Daniel gave a small, uncertain nod. I thought I'd blown everything. I walked into that lobby soaked and late and knew they'd never see past it. But someone did, Chuck said. Me. Daniel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Chuck walked around the desk and leaned back against it, arms loosely crossed. This company has seen a lot of impressive resumes, but very few people willing to make the right choice when it costs them something. That's the kind of person I want near me. He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to inspire. He just said it plainly, like someone who didn't need to prove anything. Daniel didn't speak right away. His thoughts were still catching up. I don't know what to say, he finally admitted. You don't have to say anything, Chuck replied. You already said enough that day with your actions. The room felt quieter now, not because it was empty, but because something had settled. Recognition, truth, maybe even a kind of closure. Daniel looked out the window behind Chuck. The same city that had felt so far away just a few days ago was still there, but it didn't feel out of reach anymore. It felt like something was just beginning. Chuck didn't move for a while. He just stood there, with his arms loosely folded, watching Daniel as if waiting to see how he would process everything. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that felt deliberate, like it had purpose. Daniel sat still, unsure what to ask first. A part of him still wasn't convinced this was real. When I was younger, Chuck finally said, I thought success was about being the best at everything, toughest in the room, smartest, fastest. But over time, I learned something harder. Being the best doesn't mean much if you don't know when to do the right thing, especially when it's inconvenient. He walked back to the other side of the desk, pulling out a thin folder from the drawer and laying it on the surface. Daniel recognized the worn edges immediately. It was his portfolio, the one he thought was ruined, the one he had left in the back seat of that black sedan 3 days ago. I read through this, Chuck said. There's real skill here, insight, but I've seen plenty of sharp minds burn out or crumble because they lack something more important. Integrity. The kind you showed when you could have kept walking. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not from nerves but from something quieter, harder to describe. It was rare for anyone to talk about this stuff like it mattered, like character actually had weight in a world that so often seemed ruled by connections, timing, and spotless resumes. I didn't stop because I thought someone was watching, Daniel said quietly. I stopped because he looked like my grandfather. Chuck gave a small nod. That's the answer I was hoping for. He sat down now, leaning forward slightly, elbows on the desk, voice calm but focused. I've been stepping back from public life for a while. Most people don't know I'm involved here, and I like to keep it that way. I don't want influence to come from a name. I want it to come from substance. So every now and then I look for people the system might overlook, people who do the right thing without being asked. Daniel wasn't sure what to say. He glanced down at the folder, then back up at Chuck. But I missed the interview. I didn't follow protocol. I mean, technically, I failed. Technically, Chuck agreed. You were late. You were soaked. And you left without demanding attention. But you passed the test I actually care about. He opened another drawer and took out a printed sheet. An official offer letter by the look of it. Clean font, signature space at the bottom. Daniel's name already typed in. I'd like you to come on board, Chuck said. Not as an entry-level analyst, as my special assistant. You'll work directly with me on select projects, sit in on high-level meetings, and learn how this company actually runs. From the top, not the bottom. Daniel's eyes widened. I don't even know what to say. I'm not sure I'm qualified. Chuck smiled slightly. Nobody's qualified for that role on paper. That's the point. What matters is how you think, how you act under pressure, and what you choose when no one's offering a reward. The words sank in slowly. Daniel felt a swirl of emotions, relief, disbelief, pressure, and something else that felt like pride, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. He ran a hand across his lap, trying to ground himself. I'm not afraid of hard work, he said, but I want to do it right. Good, Chuck said, because this won't be easy. You'll be questioned, you'll be doubted, You'll have to learn quickly and make mistakes in rooms where mistakes are expensive. But if you hold on to that same instinct you followed on the street that day, you'll be fine." Daniel looked at the offer again. The numbers stunned him. It was more than he had expected to make in 5 years, let alone 1. He imagined what this meant for his mother, for their rent, for the loans he hadn't even told her about yet. But more than that, he thought about his father's voice again, the one he hadn't heard in years but still knew by heart. Chuck stood and extended his hand. Once more. "So, Daniel, do we start today?" Daniel looked at him, not as a legend or a boss, but as a man who had seen something in him before anyone else did. He rose from the chair, shook the offered hand firmly, and nodded. "Yes, sir, we do." And just like that, what felt like the end 3 days ago had quietly become a beginning. The boardroom looked different from the inside. Daniel had passed it before, just glimpses through the frosted glass wall on his way to orientation or when shadowing Chuck between meetings, but this time, he was invited in. He stood just behind Chuck as they entered together, the heavy door closing softly behind them. A long table stretched down the middle of the room, polished wood gleaming under soft lights. 17 chairs, 14 of them already filled. These were people with decades of experience, most of whom could probably quote market data from memory. They looked up as Daniel entered, some with curiosity, some with skepticism. No one smiled. Chuck took his seat at the head of the table without ceremony. Daniel sat to his right, quietly adjusting his notepad and pen. He didn't expect to speak. He just wanted to observe, to listen, to absorb everything. The meeting moved fast. Financial reports, expansion plans, a major acquisition that was hitting regulatory delays. Daniel kept up, scribbling small notes, trying to keep his attention sharp. Then the conversation shifted. One of the senior partners, a woman with sharp eyes and perfect posture, began outlining options for a struggling manufacturing subsidiary. The numbers weren't good: declining margins, rising overhead, a failing supply chain. Her voice was calm, her logic airtight. "I recommend cutting losses, liquidate the assets, exit the region, and reallocate capital toward growth markets." Man across the table nodded in agreement. "There's no point in salvaging a sinking ship. The model doesn't scale." Another chimed in. "We'd save close to 15 million over the next 2 quarters. That's not small." Daniel stayed quiet. He looked over at Chuck, who hadn't spoken yet, then back at the charts on the screen. At the bottom of one of the slides, in smaller text, was a line item: 1,700 employees impacted. Entire towns in the region relied on that factory. He didn't know their names, but he knew the story. He had lived it once. Chuck leaned slightly toward him and spoke quietly. "What do you think?" Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected to be asked. Not here. "I think." He looked up, realizing the room had gone quiet. Everyone watching him now. "I think the numbers make sense on paper. But numbers don't live in those towns. People do. Closing that plant might clean the balance sheet, but it'll also collapse entire communities, local businesses, schools, homes." He took a breath. "When I was a kid, something like this happened where I grew up. One closure took out half the town. My mom lost her job. My best friend's dad couldn't make rent. It wasn't just economics, it was dignity, structure, hope." A few board members exchanged glances. Some leaned back, arms crossed. Daniel continued. "Anyway, I'm not saying we ignore the problem, but I think we should explore other options. Maybe a partial restructure, new leadership, partner with local governments or nonprofits. There's risk, yes, but there's also responsibility. We talk a lot about legacy here. Well, this is part of it." Silence hung over the room. Chuck didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. He just let it land. Then he nodded slowly. "Thank you." The CFO who had spoken earlier didn't look pleased, but she said nothing. Another executive down the line added, "We could form a task force. Give it a month. Reassess after exploring alternatives." Chuck turned back to Daniel. "Put together a list of people for that task force. You'll co-lead it. Daniel nodded. Yes, sir. The meeting moved on, but something had shifted. He could feel it. Not just in the room, but inside himself. He hadn't planned to speak. He definitely hadn't planned to challenge senior leadership on day one. But it felt right. And more than that, it felt necessary. Later that evening, after most of the building had cleared out, Daniel stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Chuck's office, watching the city slowly light up. Chuck stood beside him, silent at first. You did well today, Chuck finally said. You weren't afraid to speak the truth. Daniel nodded. I kept thinking, if I didn't say it, who would? Chuck looked at him, eyes steady. Exactly. Daniel didn't say thank you. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because that moment didn't need it. It was something deeper. As he looked down at the city, at the people moving through streets he once saw from below, Daniel realized this had never been about luck. It wasn't about being in the right place at the right time. It was about choices, quiet ones, costly ones, the kind made in the rain when no one is watching, the kind that echo in rooms like this one. He had made his choice. Now the rest was just